leaving the epoch behind. In 1945, glorious victory in the World War II was celebrated with a parade held by Stalin in Moscow at the Red Square. However, Stalin was not alone at this ceremonial event. A limited number of people received a special invitation to the Kremlin for their tremendous input into the victory. Yusif Mammadaliyev, an outstanding Azeri chemist known throughout the world by that time, was among them. In that period, legends were spread of the Russian aircraft supremacy, largely due to the high-grade and top-quality gasoline discovered by a young Azeri scholar. According to the popular saying of the day, the victory in the Patriotic War was gained partially due to Nikulin's engines, Yakovlev's aircrafts, and last but not least, Mammadaliyev's gasoline. In those tough days, discovery and production of high-quality non-freezing gasoline, so urgently demanded by aviation, allowed the newly developed aircraft models to fly further and higher and perform more maneuvers with surprise attacks. Highest state award this scientific discovery was decorated with shortly prior to the end of the war drew much attention to Yusif Mammadaliyev. So, his image of a researcher successfully combining science and technology began to arise. As it happens oftentimes, people with these outstanding talents emerge to amaze their contemporaries at the times when they are in the greatest need. However, apart from natural gifts and innate intellectual capacities, this requires hard work and lifelong dedication to the science. Residents of Ordubad, notwithstanding any hardships of history, managed to retain their ethnic and cultural traditions up to now. It was this combination of very tough lifestyle with unique historical and cultural traditions that made it possible for wizards like Yusif Mammadaliyev to emerge. Born to a patriarchal, hard-working family, Yusif managed to obtain the best education available in Ordubad at the beginning of the last century. His first educator was his mother Gulsum, a great connoisseur in Oriental folklore and poetry, and his father, who, despite working hard to provide the family's livelihood, had a special priority given to the education of his kids. The first classes the young boy got was at Molla Khane, a local theological school. The further education was provided at home, and in 1916, Yusif Mammadaliyev got enrolled at a newly opened high school in his home area. So, by the age of 13, he was fluent in Arabic, Persian, Russian, and English. Anjumani Shuara, a literary society popular in Ordubad since the 17th century, played an enormous role in further upbringing of a young man. The poetry of Saadi, Hafiz, Nizami, Fizuli, and Omar Khayyam was recited and discussed during the literary assemblies. Even though children usually would not be allowed to participate in this kind of gatherings, the elders could not help making an exception for such an infant prodigy as Yusif. His constant interest and urge to poetry was hard to resist. In 1923, 18-year-old Yusif Mammadaliyev arrives in Baku with a firm intention to dedicate himself to literature. It was an encounter with Sadi Husseinov, professor at the Azerbaijani Pedagogical Institute, that changed his plans forever. Sadi Husseinov, one of the first Azeri chemists trained in Europe, was capable of realizing the depth of intellectual capacities of a young student. So, he managed to persuade Yusif that science could be as romantic and as harmonious as literature and poetry. Mammadaliyev was truly lucky with his professors. One of them was Nikolai Zelinsky at the State University of Moscow. 2 years spent in the laboratory of Zelinsky provided Mammadaliyev with access to the most up-to-date accomplishments in chemistry, both in theory and in practice. Meanwhile, the youth of Mammadaliyev happened to coincide with the time of enormous enthusiasm shared all over former Soviet Union. Like most of his fellow countrymen, he wanted to see the practical application of his scientific research. That was the reason why, refusing insistent urges of Professor Zelinsky to continue his postgraduate studies, Mammadaliyev returns back to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan was a real hotbed of oil and gas industries. So, back at home, Yusif Mammadaliyev could fully comprehend the future prospects of petrochemical studies and oil refinement. Meanwhile, at that time, oil largely fell beyond the spectrum of chemical industries. That was the time when natural gas associated with oil was either burned or emitted to the atmosphere. The ways of utilizing this natural asset were still sought. With a global approach to this issue, young Mammadaliyev succeeded in accomplishing new scientific outcomes in utilizing gas as a chemical resource. Synthetic products gained by Yusif Mammadaliyev through chlorinating gas were the first experience of this kind in former Soviet Union. Application of synthesis of boiling catalyst bed by Yusif Mammadaliyev had no precedent in the world and got an astounding effect on his colleagues. In fact, this research emanated from an enormous interest to this matter. André Dumas, the French chemist, was the first to describe this process. However, no optimal solution for the reaction was found due to high risk of explosion. Strenuous efforts by Yusif Mammadaliyev resulted in desirable solution. The chlorine substance accomplished in this way had a significant medicinal effect in prevention of malaria, trachoma, and other infectious diseases the former Soviet republics were severely suffering from. According to the statistics, 120,000 people were effectively treated by the medicine based on Yusif Mammadaliyev's invention. Keen intuition and acute cognition in science were instrumental in Mammadaliyev's discoveries. Tracing unique life of this personality, one may see that each and every step of his had always been slightly ahead of his time. Unbridled by any stereotypes, no matter how deeply rooted, Mammadaliyev was always ready for challenge and found the possibility to comprehend any new demand of the time. However, each novice naturally brought about a lot of dispute. That was the time when the very idea of manufacturing artificial rubber was considered the product of imagination by the US researcher Edison. Meanwhile, attempts to accomplish this had been made for more than a century before by French scholar Boutard, English researcher Tilden, and a number of Russian scientists. At that time, Soviet production of Indian rubber was based on potato and wheat. Given acute shortage of basic foodstuffs in former Soviet Union, this type of production was way too costly indeed. Back in the 1930s, Yusif Mammadaliyev was sharing the idea of some scholars believing in the possibility of cheap industrial production of rubber. The way he envisaged this was through the use of Azerbaijani raw materials. The idea could only come true in the 1950s, with the first synthetic rubber production from ethyl alcohol in the world launched in the town of Sumgait, Azerbaijan. It was quite logical that each new discovery revealed a new sphere for future research. This was the way toluene was produced as the raw material for explosives. The production was accomplished shortly prior to the World War II. His ideas applied through industrial production of toluene as an important component for TNT enabled the Soviet military forces to accomplish the cheapest production of toluene in the world, notwithstanding the hardships of the World War II. This was the way Molotov cocktail was invented. the name coined by Churchill after he got briefed of using bottles with explosive substances against tanks from Molotov, that time Soviet Prime Minister. This innovation was followed by a new and even more rigorous requirements of the ongoing war. Despite severe realities of the World War II, the young Azeri chemists succeeded in production of high-grade gasoline. The scientific accomplishments constituted an enormous sacrifice by an indefatigable scholar to his homeland. Since Mammadaliyev's research resulted in formation of a whole new field of petrochemical industry, he was recognized as the king of alkylation by the US academic circles. In the meantime, Mammadaliyev was considered the founding father of the Soviet polymer production. He left his name in the history of present-day Azeri offshore oil production by being among those who pioneered unprecedented drilling operations in the Caspian Sea back in 1946. Yusif Mammadaliyev could have probably been decorated by a number of other awards and regalia should his home country take a different path of development. He managed to amaze the international academic community in the 1950s by inventing new type of propellants for strategic missiles. Beginning of the cosmic era, enriched the human science with a whole set of innovations, with Yusif Mammadaliyev's involvement as always. Interestingly enough, Mammadaliyev was a part of the group Yuri Gagarin, the worldwide famous #1 astronaut, was reporting upon completion of the first space flight. No surprise, the Soviet government was willing to nominate the Azeri scientist for the Nobel Prize due to his scientific accomplishments. However, on the very day of the decision-making process, an anonymous letter was received by the board of the Academy stating undesirability of disclosure of a classified military intelligence in the international arena. The warning was taken seriously by that time political elite. It is not excluded that ethnic origin of Yusif Mammadaliyev appeared to be another obstacle on his way to the Nobel Prize, for despite declared unity of peoples in the former USSR, attitude towards the Azeri intellectuals had always been jealous and prejudicial. In fact, Yusif Mammadaliyev never pursued honorary titles or any other ambitious intents. He worked at his homeland in the sake of his fellow citizens. While holding the position of president of the local Academy of Sciences in Azerbaijan, Yusif Mammadaliyev was personally involved in foundation of 5 new research institutes in the field of petrochemistry and the observatory in Shemaha, with one of the largest telescopes in Europe. Historical and Cultural Reserve of Kabistan, which recently got into UNESCO's scope of interest due to its 40,000 years of history, was first researched following Mammadaliyev's instruction. Even today, Yusif Mammadaliyev's legacy may be traced in all positive developments in Azerbaijan. His impassioned research and indefatigable efforts clearly demonstrate science as a global asset with no borders or boundaries whatsoever. In a number of his presentations delivered as far as in the United States, Italy, Spain, France, he could fully comprehend and enjoy the commonly shared lingua franca, which is the language of the science. Here is the audience in Paris, applauding him in 1960, just a year before his tragic and premature disease. The applause in Paris indicated a heartfelt appreciation of the humankind for the scientific discovery accomplished by an Azeri scholar more than a century after by the French chemist Henri Dumont. Delayed by good 26 years, the recognition ultimately reached the great scientist.